Travels of Marco Polo, Chapter 6. How Messrs. Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco asked permission of the Great Khan to leave. Our Venetians, having now resided many years at the imperial court, and in that time having amassed considerable wealth in jewels and gold, felt a strong desire to revisit their native country, and, however honored and well treated by the sovereign, this sentiment was ever uppermost in their minds. It became even more decidedly their object when they thought of the very advanced age of the Great Khan, and the fact that his death, if it should occur before their departure, might deprive them of the assistance they would need to surmount the innumerable difficulties of so long a journey and reach their homes in safety. Niccolo Polo accordingly took an opportunity one day, when he observed the Khan to be more than usually cheerful, of throwing himself at his feet and appealed on behalf of himself and his family for permission to depart. But far from seeming disposed to comply, the Khan appeared hurt at the appeal and asked what motive they could have for wishing to expose themselves to all the hazards of a journey in which they would probably lose their lives. If gain, he said, was their object, he was ready to give them double what they possessed and to gratify them with honors to the full extent of their desires, but that, from the regard he had for them, he must positively refuse their petition. It happened about this period that a queen named Bolgana, Bulugan, the wife of Argun, sovereign of India, actually Persia, died, and her last request, which she repeated in a will, entreated her husband that no one might succeed to her place on his throne and in his affections who was not a descendant of her own family, which was now settled under the dominion of the Great Khan of Cathay. Wishing to comply with this solemn request, Argun appointed 3 of his barons, discreet men, whose names were Ulatai, Apushka, and Koya, together with a numerous retinue and his ambassadors to the Great Khan, with a request that the Khan find him a wife from among the relatives of his deceased queen. The application was taken in good part, and under the discretion of His Majesty, choice was made of a damsel of 17, very beautiful and accomplished, whose name was Kokachin, and of whom the ambassadors highly approved. When everything was arranged for their departure, and a suite of attendants appointed to do honor to the future consort of King Argun, they received a gracious farewell from the Great Khan and set out on their return by the way they had come. Having traveled for 8 months, their progress was blocked and the roads shut against them by fresh wars that had broken out among the Tartar princes. Much against their will, they were forced to turn back to the court of the Great Khan and tell him of the interruption they had met with. About the time of their turning back, Marco Polo happened to arrive from a voyage he had made, with a few vessels under his command, to some parts of the East Indies, in some manuscripts India, and reported to the Great Khan concerning the countries he had visited, with the details of his voyage, which, he said, was made with the utmost safety. This latter observation having reached the ears of the 3 barons, who were extremely anxious to return to their own country, from which they had now been absent 3 years, they sought a conference with our Venetians, whom they found equally desirous of going home. It was settled between them that the former, accompanied by their young queen, should obtain an audience with the Great Khan and represent to him how conveniently and safely they might return by sea to the dominions of their master, a voyage that would be less costly than the journey by land, and be performed in a shorter time. All this according to the experience of Marco Polo, who had lately sailed in those parts. Should His Majesty incline to give his consent to their suggestion, they would then urge him to allow the 3 Europeans, as persons skilled in navigation, to accompany them to the territory of King Argun. On hearing this appeal, the Great Khan showed by his countenance that it was very displeasing to him, unwilling as he was to have the Venetians leave. Feeling nevertheless that he could not properly withhold his consent, he yielded. Had he not been forced by this peculiar situation, they would never have obtained permission to leave his service. He sent for them, however, and addressed them with much kindness and friendliness, assuring them of his regard, and exacted from them a promise that when they had stayed some time in Europe, and with their own family, they would return to him once more. With this in view, he caused them to be given golden tablets, ordering their free and safe conduct through every part of his dominions, with all necessary supplies for themselves and their attendants. He likewise gave them authority to act as his emissaries to the Pope, the kings of France and Spain, one Polo manuscript also mentions England, and the other Christian princes. Chapter 7. How the 2 brothers and Messer Marco left the Great Khan and returned home. At the same time, preparations were made for equipping 14 ships, each having 4 masts and 9 sails, the construction and rigging of which would admit of a long description, but it is for the present omitted. Among these vessels, there were at least 4 or 5 that had crews of 250 or 260 men. On them were embarked the barons, with the queen under the protection, together with Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco Polo. When they took leave of the Great Khan, he presented them with many rubies and other fine jewels. He also gave directions that the ship should be furnished with stores and provisions for 2 years. After a voyage of about 3 months in a southerly direction, they arrived at an island named Java, actually Sumatra, where they saw various objects worthy of attention, of which notice shall be taken later in this work. Departing thence, they spent 18 months in the Indian seas before they could reach their destination in the territory of King Argun, and also during this part of their voyage they had an opportunity of observing many things, which shall be related hereafter. But here it may be proper to mention that between the day of their sailing and that of their arrival they lost, among the crews of the vessels and others, about 600 persons, and of the 3 barons only one, whose name was Koya, survived the voyage. But of all the ladies and female attendants only one died. Upon landing they were informed that King Argun had died some time before, and that the government of the country was then administered on behalf of his son, who was still a youth, by a person named Kiakatu. From him they asked instructions as to how they should dispose of the princess, whom by order of the late king they had conducted thither. His answer was that they ought to present the lady to Ghazan, the son of Argun, who was then at Arbor Seco, a place on the borders of Persia, in the province of Khorasan, where an army of 60,000 men was assembled to guard certain passes against an invasion by the enemy. Having done this, they returned to the residence of Kiakatu, because the road they were afterward to take lay in that direction. Here, however, they rested for the space of 9 months. When they took their leave, he furnished them with 3 golden tablets, each of them a cubit, about 18 inches in length, 5 inches wide, and weighing 3 or 4 marks of gold. Their inscription began with invoking the blessing of the Almighty upon the great Khan, that his name might be held in reverence for many years, and threatening death and confiscating of goods to all who disobeyed. It directed that the 3 ambassadors, as his representatives, should be treated throughout his dominions with honor, that their expenses should be defrayed, and that they should be provided with all the necessary escorts. All that was complied with fully, and in many places they were protected by bodies of 200 horsemen. Nor could they have done without this, as the government of Kiakatu was unpopular and the people were disposed to insult them and cause trouble, which they would not have dared under the rule of their proper sovereign. In the course of their journey, our travelers received news that the great Khan, Kublai, had departed this life, which put an end to all prospect of their revisiting those regions. Pursuing, therefore, their intended route, they at length reached the city of Trebizond, where they proceeded to Constantinople, then to Negropont, and finally Venice, at which place, enjoying health and riches, they arrived in the year of 1295. On this occasion they offered up their thanks to God, who had now been pleased to receive them from such great fatigues, after having preserved them from innumerable perils. Their foregoing narrative may be considered as a preliminary chapter to the object of which is to make the reader acquainted with the opportunities Marco Polo had, during a residence of so many years in the eastern parts of the world, of acquiring knowledge of things he describes.